All right, let's talk about the autonomic nervous system. And as we do, we're going to answer a couple questions like, what are the functions of the autonomic nervous system? What are the sympathetic and parasympathetic pathways? And what is the two-neuron motor pattern of the autonomic nervous system? The autonomic nervous system can almost be thought of as the automatic nervous system because it innervates smooth muscle, which is involuntary, as well as modified cardiac muscle and glandular tissue. It also does sensory innervation to hollow organs and blood vessels, specifically with pain and visceral reflex sensations. And the nerve fibers used to do all this are visceral motor fibers, which are efferent, and there are two. There's a preganglionic and postganglionic, which we'll talk about in a second. And then for the sensory innervation, the fibers are the visceral sensory fibers, which are afferent. Then there are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system that perform all of these functions. And those are the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. And you'll remember from our overview that the sympathetic division function is phrased as fight or flight, and the parasympathetic division's function is phrased as rest, digest, and read. So looking at this table from Moore's, we can see the functions of the sympathetic division as well as the parasympathetic division. And if we look at the heart, for example, we'll see that the sympathetic division does fight or flight, so it's going to increase the rate and strength of the contraction of the heart. Whereas the parasympathetic division does rest, digest, and read, so that is going to decrease the rate and strength of contraction of the heart. And we won't go through every column on this table, but they all fit really well with either being fight or flight with sympathetic or rest, digest, and read with parasympathetic. And this would definitely be a table that I would be familiar with. Not that you necessarily have to memorize the entire thing, but just understanding what would be fight or flight with sympathetic and what would be rest, digest, and read with parasympathetic. Now switching tables, we can see the different functions of the sympathetic division versus the parasympathetic division. We already went over this table in the overview, so I'm not going to really touch on everything, but I do want to look at the visceral motor synapse row. And you'll see in the sympathetic division, there's short preganglionic fibers with long postganglionic fibers. And then in the parasympathetic division, there are long preganglionic fibers but short postganglionic fibers. So what is going on there? The autonomic nervous system has a two-neuron visceral motor pathway, and we're going to use a little graphic here to show how it all works. So this first box here is going to represent the central nervous system, so either the brain or the spinal cord. And then the stomach is going to represent a target structure of smooth muscle that we're trying to innervate. Then we're going to use what is called a splanchnic nerve to go from the central nervous system to this target structure. And you'll see there's a swelling in the middle of this splanchnic nerve, so we're going to call that an autonomic ganglion. And we remember ganglion house cell bodies of neurons. So from the CNS in green here, we're going to have a preganglionic neuron that has its cell body in the central nervous system, and then it's coming out to this autonomic ganglion. And then in the autonomic ganglion, it's going to synapse with the cell body of a postganglionic neuron here in purple. And then the postganglionic neuron is what's going to eventually get to the target structure. So now let's take that general pattern and apply it to the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So starting first with the sympathetic division, we're just going to keep the same graphic, but we're going to end up changing a couple names. Instead of using CNS, we can be a little bit more specific. So we're going to change that to the T1 to L2 lateral horn of the spinal cord. Then we're going to call the nerve a sympathetic splanchnic nerve. And the ganglion is going to be either a paravertebral or a prevertebral ganglion, just kind of depending on which one ends up being closer to the target structure. And that is the two-neuron motor pathway for the sympathetic division. Moving on to our two-neuron motor pathway for the parasympathetic division, it's a little bit more unique, so we're going to build our pathway from scratch. To start, we'll actually have our central nervous system box be representative of either the brain or the S2 through S4 segments of the spinal cord. And then we're going to use the smooth muscle in the stomach as our target structure again. Then the nerve connecting the CNS to the target structure here is either going to be a cranial nerve if it's coming from the brain, or a parasympathetic splanchnic nerve if it's coming from S2 to S4. One difference that we can see comparing the parasympathetic to the sympathetic is that the ganglion isn't in the middle of the nerve, it's actually all the way over in the target structure. And because of that, we're going to call it an intramural ganglion. And mural just refers to wall, so intramural literally means within the wall or between the walls. And now we'll add our green preganglionic neuron with a cell body in either the brain or the S2 through S4 spinal cord. And you'll see that goes all the way out to the intramural ganglion, where it then synapses with the purple postganglionic neuron, which is really short because it's already just right there within the wall of the target structure. And that is it for this autonomic nervous system overview, so let's do a quick recap. We learned there are two autonomic nervous system divisions, a sympathetic division with roles that fall under a fight or flight response, and a parasympathetic division with roles that fall under a rest, digest, and read type of situation. We also learned the autonomic nervous system has a two-neuron visceral motor pathway, with preganglionic neurons having their cell bodies in the central nervous system, and postganglionic neurons that have their cell bodies in ganglia. And that is it for our recap of the autonomic nervous system.